Good morning. I want to welcome all of you and congratulate you for extraordinary conference stamina. I trust that some of you even did the wonderful Wagner opera here last night after the awards ceremony. We have, I think, a very interesting conversation for you with a terrific panel on the war of ideas. Does it exist? What does it mean? What do we do? And you have seen the program. We will start with Timothy Garton of Oxford and a leading thinker on these issues, Marieluise Beck from the German Bundestag, a longtime thought leader in the Green Party, Jacek Rostowski, the former Polish finance minister, and our friend from Estonia, who is the great communications strategist. And I want to start with you, Tim. Set the stage for us in terms of the war of ideas. Do you feel reminded we're sort of back in the year 1990, but with different hopes?
I would say, alas, not. But let me start by saying that I don't think you'd often meet a butcher who would tell you it's not worth eating meat, or a greengrocer who would tell you you shouldn't eat vegetables. So obviously an intellectual is going to tell you that ideas matter. And they do matter, and there has always been a war of ideas. And in 1989, 1990, putting it very simply, our ideas won. And I say our ideas, this is important. I don't say we won. It was the fact that Poles and Hungarians and Czechs and Slovaks and Estonians, and let's remember also Russians, embraced and fought for those ideas of freedom and liberal democracy, which brought that victory. And in the book I wrote about 1989, at that time called The Magic Lantern, I quoted the famous sentence attributed to Victor Hugo, nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. Now the problem is, a quarter century on, we're in a very different time. And you need both, the good ideas and the time. And now we are clearly, in some sense, on the defensive. Islamism, which appeals not only to our Muslim populations, but also to converts. Authoritarian capitalism as a model. I would actually say not so much the Russian version, but the Chinese version, which is very successfully propagated with considerable success in continents like Africa and Latin America. We have to say, frankly, failures of our own system in the major crisis since 2009, which has provoked a lot of criticism and doubt in our own societies, anti-system parties doubting, and also, may I say, quite simply the fact that liberal democracy has been triumphant in Europe for a quarter century, at least. And a lot of people have got bored with it. You know, they've been hearing the same thing for 25 years. You've experienced this in Poland a bit. Boredom is an underrated factor in politics. And so they turn to more attractive, more interesting, more exciting anti-system parties. What do we do about it? Let me just say quickly 3 things. Number one, I think it would be a great mistake to say what we do about it is circle the wagons, we are the West, you are the rest, defend the West against the rest. We have our culture, you have yours, a Samuel Huntington formula. This would be a huge mistake, not only because we give up on the rest of humankind, but also because we won't win the war of ideas inside our own societies if we're so much in the defensive. What the thinkers of the Enlightenment said was there are certain universal truths, and there are certain moral principles which are universal. If everyone did it like this everywhere, everyone would be better off. And that's where we need to be. But let me just add one thing on how we do that, on how we make the argument for values that we believe are genuinely universal. Apart from worrying about Europe, which I do a great deal of, as some of you will know, I've spent the last 7 years writing a book about free speech. And essentially, if you're thinking about global free speech, there are sort of two positions you can take. One is what I might call the missionary position, if you'll forgive the phrase, which is to say, hey guys, we in the West have worked the whole thing out. Okay? Now, I actually happen to believe that the First Amendment is the greatest institutional tradition of free speech in human history. But I don't think it's a great idea to go out to the rest of the world and say, hey guys, we've just got the whole thing worked out. All you need to do is go to IKEA and buy the kit for free speech. And if you can understand the instructions, then you can build the furniture. And that's sort of what we did to some extent in the 1990s. And I can tell you, it doesn't work these days. It doesn't work for two reasons. Number one, because the rest of the world is no longer quite so ready to hear that message, that we've got all the answers, but also because in substance it is not right, because the very essence of free speech is the idea that the other guy might have a point, that you want to hear all points of view and then have the conversation. So what we've been trying to do at a project I lead at Oxford, what I try to do in the book, is to strip down these universal principles to the most simple, most basic, most universal language. For example, on religion, the principle we put forward is we respect the believer, but not necessarily the content of the belief. And then you put it out there for discussion in China, in India, in Russia, in Brazil. And I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if you do it that way, not in the missionary position, not in we've got all the answers, you get a completely different conversation. And there are millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people out there who are ready to engage and actually embrace those universal values if we hold the conversation in that way. Let me finish, Stephan, just by saying this. There's a kind of epigraph that has accompanied me throughout my writing life. It's a text that was pinned by an unknown striker to a cross outside the Lenin shipyard in Gdańsk in August 1980. It's the famous Polish translation of some lines from Lord Byron: "For freedom's battle once begun, bequeathed by bleeding sire to son, though baffled oft, is ever won." And I believe that is still true, but we have a big battle on our hands, and it'll take some time, but if we keep fighting the battle, I think if we gather again here in 25 years, we will be able to say, that battle too we have won.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Ilmar Raag, who lives on the front line of the grand design. So I think Timothy laid down a wonderful picture of the entire framework, but you don't just live in Estonia, you're also professionally responsible for translating this down to earth in terms of communication strategies, in terms of a political operating environment in a specific country. How do you respond to how the stage has been set? What are your practical experiences and the challenges you see?
Yes, somehow I feel that very often that I'm split. From one side, I like to argue, I like to have this noble art of intellectual war of ideas. But from the other side, if we are going to the real world, then we start to see that the contemporary world is very fragmented, and if you're talking about ideas in a society, then actually you're talking about different social groups who have different sensibilities to different ideas. And then in the end, you should have some kind of willingness to do something, and then you adopt this something that in military terms is called effect-based operation. That you should know what kind of change or effect you are looking for in a society, and then you see how you can do it based on your values. The values are definitely things that put some limits. The really interesting thing for me is the question why some people, some groups, may have oppositional reading of some ideas. The clearest example of European identity or the solidarity idea, when in Eastern Europe it's understood in one way, and right now in Italy or in Spain in a completely different way. So we don't understand really clearly each other's concerns. And knowing that this is common sense, that this kind of oppositional readings exists, we are going further and asking what are the factors that determine this kind of reading. And according to what I have experienced in Estonia, this is mostly related to the group identity or economical stability. And now going to the core of my concern in Estonia, then as a fact we have had this kind of migration during the Soviet years, when from 9% of Russian population, suddenly we have 30% of Russian population. And today we are living in this country where we have two important ethnic groups. And the future depends on how peacefully we can live in this one country. And we see that there is a part of this Russian population who interprets the world according to the Kremlin propaganda. And this is very oppositional to the Western views that is adopted by the biggest part of Estonian population. If we go to see how can we convince them, then as it was proposed, the first idea is to still to look for some common ground. Because unless you are finding this common ground, you cannot convince each other. You cannot start even this discussion. And then, if we go further, then I understand that basically this is still a question of comfortable identity. Because those Russians in Estonia, they sometimes feel that they are still unimportant minority in this country, where in the previous years they used to be proud of belonging to the most powerful country in the world. And how we deal with this kind of lost identity. We started the Russian language public television channel. Many say that this will be a propaganda channel to convert Russians. We're saying no. The most important thing is not to start with propaganda, but just a creation of some common, the local identity. And then we can continue with a discussion.
Thank you very much. Jacek Rostowski, obviously we all have to worry about Russia, but I'd like to ask you, in your dual nationality, as a Pole, what are lessons from the Polish experience, proud Polish experience of the last 25 years, that are relevant for some of the countries in an operational sense that are on the front lines, whether it's Estonia or other countries, including Ukraine? And the second question, as I understand, still a British citizen, what are you worried about in terms of the former great leaders for freedom in the Western world? What are your real concerns about, to take your metaphor, about their manlyhood right now, in terms of Timothy's language?
Well, if you'll allow me, I'll avoid the first question, because I actually think that there aren't that many lessons to be had. I mean, if you're in Ukraine, you're in the middle of a war. We never had a war. We had martial law, which was a completely different kind of operation. If you're in Estonia, you're part of the strongest alliance that ever existed in history. And if you're worried for other reasons than purely military ones and than internal ones, although there is some internal concern. I rather wanted to go back and make a few comments on what Timothy said. Because I think in this context, in terms of the really enormous changes that have been happening in the realm of ideas, from a situation 20 years ago when it seemed that democracy was entirely triumphant in terms of going forward. It hadn't conquered the whole world, but was going forward right across the world, to a situation where now, as Timothy says, and as I think, well, I certainly agree, it's on the defensive. The temptation arises to reach for, when we want to understand this, to reach for Karl Marx and say, well, if very big changes are happening in the superstructure of consciousness, culture, and political institutions, that's probably because there have been some pretty big changes in the base of productive relations, as Marx would have said. And what has basically happened is that in 1990, two sets of ideas won. One set of ideas was liberal democracy, and the other set of ideas was liberal markets. And while it was very definitely in the West's interests to export liberal democracy, what happened, we simultaneously exported liberal markets. In other words, we engaged in the greatest, probably ever in history, transfer of social and economic know-how that has ever taken place. We convinced, or we helped the Chinese to convince themselves to move to free markets. And of course, very much the same happened in Latin America, which is less of a problem to some extent in India, but also, of course, throughout this region, where we have both liberal democracy and free markets, but also markets, though not entirely free, in Russia. And the result is that we gave countries that are, or regimes that are, far from democracy and freedom, the instruments to improve the economic situation of their countries. It didn't happen immediately. In fact, of course, the very short term, there were high costs. But over the 25 years, particularly in China, but also in Russia, the progress in terms of GDP has been enormous. At the same time, we, and Timothy's mentioned that as well, we actually managed to manage our own free markets appallingly badly. Let's leave aside the question of Federal Reserve monetary policy under Alan Greenspan, which is probably the source of the Great Recession and the great financial crash of 2008. But that sort of thing can happen. But at the same time, we created a highly dysfunctional Eurozone, which, under the impact of the crash of 2008, showed all its really deep fault lines. And we haven't resolved that to this day. And so, given what has happened, a rising authoritarian part of the world and a democratic part of the world which has not really been able to cope with its problems effectively. More so in the United States. There was a period a couple of years ago when the United States seemed to be heading for the same kind of political deadlock that Europe is in, with the extreme polarization of politics between the two parties. That we seem to have moved beyond that to a stage where ordinary political rivalry has returned, but we don't have the extremes that we had 3 or 4 years ago. But we still have this major political, institutional, economic problem in the Eurozone. And therefore it's hardly surprising that the ideals of democracy and free speech that are associated with our part of the world, which is doing, with the Atlantic world, which is doing relatively badly, are not held in the same esteem. And the answer is, if you want to get the superstructure right, fix the base, fix the infrastructure.
Yeah. Thank you. Marieluise Beck, Estonia is a frontline state now. Germany, when we were young, used to be a frontline state. Has it learned the lessons? Is it applying the lessons of the benefits of no longer being in that position, or is it coasting in happiness that the border and the front lines have moved east significantly? And rather than just talking big picture, I'd like to, because I remember you when I studied in Bonn in the 1980s, and you were one of the startup Greens. I'd like for you to cast this also a little bit in terms of your own personal political journey, because I think there's been an interesting evolution. So if you could tackle both of these things, that would, I think, be very interesting for the audience.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, I think when you look down at Germany, you can really see how this country that was being split and the competition of ideas was within our own republic. And me, being a young politician, started in Bonn, being the capital, and there was a second capital being East Berlin, and now we are combined. You can somehow look back on number one. Obviously, there has been freedom and liberal democracy that managed to create the nation as a whole again. And everybody, I think, remembers as well the pictures of this word, Mr. President, tear down this wall, which at that time in Germany, I think almost nobody thought could be a serious say, because we didn't believe that this wall would fall down within the next 100 years. You had this optimism, which was more realistic than our pessimism. And then, though we have started after, in 1990, moving to Berlin, the shock about reality, and there is a shock within our own country. It is not that you go into the former Eastern states which we have in our federation, and that you find the most enthusiasm about the idea of liberalism and freedom, because those people in their families have had the experience how it is and how it has been living with 100,000 Stasi members being linked to the Secret Service, almost no family where you didn't have to be afraid that one of the members was carrying out of the family what was being taught about at the kitchen table. So the expectation would be there is the most enthusiastic population about freedom and liberalism, and they are most enthusiastic to carry it on to other countries which are within Europe, because actually what we are fighting about is trying to move the Yalta border, which unfortunately has been accepted in 1945. This Yalta split of Europe has to be pushed back and back and back, and when Poland and the Baltic states now belong to the free world, we know Ukrainian hopefully will be next. And the experience we make that obviously with freedom, there is some ingredients which come along which are being felt and seen as the negative points. Freedom also means insecurity, maybe loss of equality, and a modern life where temptations are so big. The roles, the role patterns which you can choose to live in, which you are being asked to live in, are so much that the enthusiasm is boiling down. And when you look at the German society, you have still 20 years after the reuniting, a very big difference within our society in former DDR population, where obviously freedom is not the number one top, but it is equality and security and much emotion, now positive emotion towards the old times where, yes, okay, we had to drive the Trabi, it was not a good car, but now we see the big difference and so many people having the Mercedes and still I'm not only driving a Mazda. So what you might expect that Germany, that has been lucky enough to be freed in 1945 by the Allied troops, and then again having had the luck to be reunited, more freedom for the second part of the country, the pessimism is very big, and the willingness to fight for freedom for others is even smaller, and the Pew investigations that just have come out, the polls, yes, just having come out, that 57% of the German population say NATO and Article 5 in case of the Baltic states or any other allies being offended, no way. So I think we have a long way to go. And another facet which I might draw your attention to, the Russian propaganda obviously has been the strongest in Germany, and I think they know what they are doing, because they know that especially in Germany, skepticism towards liberal ideas, ideas of freedom, is very big, because there has been double standards. We have made mistakes, Iraqi war, governments lying at the population has hurt our own value system. We must talk about that. So there is knowledge about double standards, but there is a skepticism that the free world is really bringing all the benefits, and there is a notion that a little bit more of authoritarian regime brings stability, and stability, I think, is just as important in our thinking than freedom.
So in case you missed it, I want to point out the cultural transformation that has happened in the most lively part of the German political establishment, because the Greens are part of that. In the mid-'80s, it was about SS-20, nuclear power, and dual-track decisions on NATO. And that is a very far journey and an appreciated journey to the concerns you articulate these days. So I think that's very important. But Timothy, I know you wanted to jump in, but as you do, the headline about the Pew poll was that the Germans, the majority of the Germans didn't want to jump in sort of under Article 5 obligations. But that's giving the Germans, in some sense, too much credit, because these days when the Americans look at Europe, they dial 4930 and whatever the numbers for the chances. The Germans weren't the only bad news, because it was pretty consistent. They reflected more or less the European position. And with you having been a leading intellect of this freedom journey and still residing in the UK, you must also be worried about the muscle that the UK is willing to bring to the equation these days.
Yes, absolutely I am, and I'm worried about the UK altogether in many respects, starting with the prospect of Britain leaving the European Union, continuing with the steady decline in defense spending, spending on the Foreign Office, spending on the BBC. So I think that is very worrying indeed. Let's put it all in the NHS. Can I just say two things responding to others? The first is, I think it's really important to keep in view both the urgent and the important. It seems to me absolutely clear that the long-term, major global ideological strategic challenge is China, not Russia. Russia is a declining regional power, a very dangerous one which is behaving outrageously. China is an emerging superpower.
Which is why I understand your child has studied there and my son is just finishing his studies there. So much for the new European realities.
They're certainly interested in it. And what is more, China's a place which seems to be showing, I stress seems to be showing, that authoritarian capitalism might be a serious competitor to Western liberal democratic capitalism. And also, this picks up what Jacek said, Karl Marx famously said, die herrschende Ideen sind die Ideen der Herrschenden. The ruling ideas are the ideas of the rulers. Now, that's not strictly true, but there is some correlation between the fact of national power and the attractiveness of the ideas. So there is some correlation between the fact of American and Western power in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the attraction of Western ideas. And now it's slightly the other way around in the case of China, particularly because China owns half the media in Africa and Latin America and can therefore propagate these ideas. And this is the second point, which is what I was saying in my introductory remarks was you've got to have the best ideas presented in the clearest, simplest, most universal ways, tested against the best challenge you can make to them, as John Stuart Mill said. But then you've actually got to get the ideas out there. And this picks up what Marieluise was saying. This is something we are doing very badly. The fact is both, particularly Russia actually, to some extent China, are doing a much better job. We used to think of Russia today as a rather crude operation. It's no longer called Russia today, it's called RT. It's been rebranded.
And it's modern, more modern than our
Some of my
TV.
students don't even know that's Russia Today. They just think it's RT. They go to the website, look at the YouTube videos, which are brilliantly done. They tell you about the life of a farmer in Detroit, which is a tough life, a farmer in Detroit. And by the way, something I love, we say TTIP, which by the way is a terrible name in my view. They call it tip, with contempt. Tip. Just tip. It's on the tip and so on. It's brilliantly done.
Yeah.
Say what you like. It's brilliantly done. What are we doing by comparison? What we used to call international broadcasting is feeble by comparison. And I have to say, with deep regret, that if I may say so, possibly one of the best international news organizations in the world, the BBC, with its international broadcasting, is being cut and cut and cut. So operationally, we not only have to have those good ideas, we have to have the international broadcasters to get them out there.
Jacek, Russia, a regional power, how does China, in the big fight for ideas, factor into your equation?
Well, Russia's obviously a bigger problem for us in the short term, partly because of its sophistication, but partly because it's within the same cultural sphere, or more or less the same cultural sphere. China is not. The good news on the infrastructure is that China is slowing down very fast, and India is accelerating. And India has 60 odd years of real experience with real democracy. And its population is growing, and its population will probably exceed China's population. And although India is chaotic, it doesn't mean that in 20, 30 years' time, it may not be a bigger economy than China. And that could be, because I wanted to inject an element from the base, an element of optimism, that could be the fundamental game changer for the longer term. But in the meantime, if I may just finish, everything in politics is always a holding operation. And while we're waiting for India to come on stream, we have to hold the line. We have to hold the front line. And one of the things we have to do is to face up to this Russian propaganda, this very sophisticated Russian propaganda. And I think in a way we have to refine the determination that we had in the early Cold War. I'm much less impressed with the idea that we should be supporting the BBC. Whenever I listen to the BBC, it seems to be flagellating Western values, flagellating Western policy, flagellating belief in democracy, saying, but on the other hand, it is a good idea to crucify somebody because he's a heretic. He belongs to a heretical branch of Islam. Or maybe it is. What do you think, Ahmed, in Ramada? It's really got to stop. I mean, this is absurd. And the other point that I think is worth coming to is we're paying the price for a kind of dominance of the center, particularly in Europe, not in the United States, where politics are much more polarized. But we got through the first phase of the Cold War, and most of the Cold War, with highly polarized politics in Western Europe, between a left and a right. Part of that left was Soviet-leaning, not all of it. Part of it was very staunch. But politics was extremely polarized. The lack of polarization about what we want to do internally is one of the reasons why we seem to have lost our way, because politics is about how conflict gives you direction. And we've lost a lot of the internal conflict that would give us the external direction.
I want to come to questions from the audience in a minute, but just add two elements to the philosophical debate about Karl Marx. And Jacek, you just said the BBC is too critical of the Western system. Maybe I want to refer to a little bit of Kant and Hegel, that self-criticism is also a sign of strength. And we should not forget that, especially in the media model where the English language media were dominated by two American titles who really preached the mothership for a long time. And in Europe, we have this problem of not having thought leadership media in a European language of some sort. So part of this is a problem of our own creation. And on India, let's hope so, but it reminds me of The Economist magazine that every 3 to 6 years has this cover that it's forget China, it's India, and they may have 600 million people too many for what they can deal with the infrastructure given the birth rate. Marieluise, you wanted to say something quickly, and then I look for the first question. And whoever has the microphone, if you could come to the gentleman here in the right. And if we have two microphones, then the next one is going to be on the left corner there, the gentleman in the gray jacket. But
I just wanted to say, nobody of us knows, if you take a very long perspective, whether in the end liberal ideas might win all over the world. But at the moment, what we experience with the crisis within EU, we see that 28 states having to negotiate, finding compromises, obviously makes us very slow. And our population experiences that we are not able to manage crises fast, like we see with our money market crisis. Plus, on the political stage, take the annexation of Crimea. Practically nothing happened. No, Russia annexed Crimea. There had been, KSCE, everything that they had been signing was being wiped away. And how did Europe react? They put a few names on a blocking list. That was the first reaction. Sanctions started when the MH17 was being taken down. We don't realize that anymore. So what we experience at the moment, and unfortunately it's at the cost of the freedom fight of the Ukrainians, which we even don't call a freedom fight in many European countries or parts of our societies, we experience authoritarian Russia creates an asymmetric situation, seemingly being more powerful than a liberal communication of 28 strong, economically strong countries which claim to be the Western world or part of the Western world. And that's not a good example. It's not making you optimistic.
Thank you very much. The first question on the right, and if you could mention your affiliation and a brief question, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. Rafał Modric, I'm with the Polish radio. Interestingly, I was made redundant from the BBC World Service 10 years ago when they were closing down the Polish service and 9 others. I've got 2 questions. The first one is for Mr. Rostowski. You mentioned China, and the world we're living in has been made in Britain but manufactured in China, and now it is being bought by China. Is that a headache for you in terms of possible transfer of Chinese ideas onto the new territories? And the other is for Ms. Beck, and I'm sorry if it's a bit local or parochial, if you like, but since you mentioned The Economist, 2 weeks ago it wrote that it's about Poland's elections. The danger is that Mr. Duda's election could herald the return of the erratic and confrontational Poland of pieces, this is Law and Justice, previous term in power, which was characterized by domestic and international paranoia, particularly towards Germany. We seem to be having a major earthquake on the Polish political scene. Are you afraid of that paranoia coming back? Thank you.
Ladies first.
I do not want to interfere too much into the maybe decisions of the Polish people. Please, let me be polite enough. I think and I hope that especially the good relations that we have been working on between Germany and Poland will be carried on no matter which government the Polish people will elect. Number one, okay?
So on that one, the answer translated is either you see that the Germans have become diplomats now, or that they show quiet confidence,
it's a wish.
or option
It's
3
not,
is both of those.
It's also a wish. It's a deep wish.
I understand.
I'm historian enough to know what a big gift that is, that Polish and German people meet each other like they do now.
I couldn't
It's
agree
not
more,
only
because at
diplomacy.
international panels in the past, I mentioned that to the minister before, I cracked up scared French audiences in the context of the famous Franco-German motor of the European Union, and the French aren't motoring so well. One of my favorite lines has been in the past to say, we may all worry about the French, but as long as the then sitting Polish finance minister and the German finance minister can finish each other's sentences blindly, they did that for a while, that is major progress on the European front. So if the German-Polish motor works, maybe the French get a message out of that. So I second what you said. But please go ahead.
Okay, if I can just cover a couple of points. First of all, no, I don't think that the Chinese ideology is going to be easily accepted in our cultural space. How many people have any idea of what Confucianism might be, right? Just as it's quite difficult for liberal democracy to be accepted in mainland China, although not in Taiwan and not in Hong Kong, with Singapore being a very special example, somewhere in between. So no, I don't see that as a threat. I see the threat really from a self-confident, authoritarian, arch-conservative Russia playing to egoism and fear of unnecessary dangers in the West far more. And here I think the Pew opinion poll is hardly surprising. I mean, ask a stupid question, get a stupid answer. Ask people if they want to take a risk to defend someone else, and of course they'll tell you they don't. The question should have been, do you want other countries to fulfill their Article 5 obligations to Germany? And then, having asked that, do you want Germany to fulfill its Article 5 obligations to Estonia? Do you want the United States to fulfill its Article 5 obligations to Germany if there's a need? And then do you want Germany to fulfill its Article 5 obligations to Estonia? Otherwise, the answer is quite obviously no. And I'm surprised that there's 42% of Germans who having been asked the question in that way, even expressed any kind of doubt as to, any kind of willingness to consider meeting those obligations. So that was the first thing. The second thing on self-criticism, that was very nice of Kant, but Kant was rather special in the Enlightenment. Most of the thinkers of the Enlightenment did not suffer from reticence as far as the strength of their belief in their ideas went. They were supremely self-confident that they were right, and that man was born good and was corrupted only by kings and priests. And what the BBC seems to do, and I have no inhibition in saying this, is every single issue is always presented to the other side to present its counter view. However outrageously barbaric it may be. And until we rid ourselves of that, we shall indefinitely be on the defensive against people who not only brutal, rich, but also intelligent.
On the other hand, in Europe, we all remember our contingent during student politics times of Trotskyists, Marxists, Leninists, and so on. And I think we've made some progress in Europe if these political forces' major vector these days is to argue for QE3, which ironically is something that unites them with you. So that tells you also of the strong journey that Europe has made. But you wanted to jump in, please.
I wanted to...
And then the next question comes over there.
I jump in on the question that it seems to me sometimes that if we're saying that liberal democracy has won in Europe or in the Western world, maybe this is a little bit exaggeration, that maybe liberal democracy as a concept is still a concept of elite that is not really accepted by everybody in the societies. That could be also quite normal. And if we take another example of a RT, Russia Today, then what the Russians are trying to do is not exactly to propagate Russian views. I don't know exactly what it is. But what they do is very pragmatic or even cynical. They need to disrupt European or transatlantic unity. And that's why they empower existing real problems. So this is not the Russian propaganda. They're taking our problems and trying to make them bigger.
Yeah. Question over there.
Yes, good morning. Slavomir Kidas, I'm from here. I have a question related to the poll in Germany. There was a poll in Poland recently whether Poles would like to adopt euro currency. And my question is to Professor Rostowski, a great finance minister. What is your opinion about the impact of the currency to the safety of the state? Thank you.
Is that suitable for this panel?
Yes, because it's part of the defensive structure of Poland, in my view.
Okay. Well, first of all, to make it clear, I certainly don't think that adopting the euro would make us in any way safer in the short to medium term, militarily. No way, all right? Maybe Estonians feel safer because they've got the euro, but I prefer being where we are and how big we are and not having the euro to the other way around. So
we are happy, yes, thank you.
I don't think it's got anything to do with Poland's military safety. Given that the euro is fundamentally flawed and evidently generates powerful economic crises, in fact, it's likely to undermine Poland's security in the short to medium term. We've managed to increase our defense spending by something of the order of just short of 50% in euro terms since 2009, and our defense spending is now slightly above Spanish defense spending, whereas it was about 40% of Spanish defense spending in 2009. Of course, Spanish defense spending has come down as well. So until the euro is fixed, we would not benefit in security terms from joining it. Once it is fixed, it will probably not be fixed to the extent to which one can join it without being a lot better prepared than we used to think we needed to be. And I don't want to, and I think maybe that's enough to say, except to add, in the end, of course, we will want to join because it's unthinkable that the euro will survive for 10, 15, 20 years unless it's been fixed. And when it's been fixed properly, so that it's resistant, so that it in general and the countries within it are resistant to large macroeconomic crises, that will be a good time to join.
Next question over there also. You have the mic? Who is the question after that? We have time for one more, I think.
Thank you, Tom Firestone from the law firm Baker & McKenzie. The panel's been very interesting, and it seems like everybody is kind of operating on the assumption that there are two options, liberalism versus authoritarianism, and there's been a lot of discussion at this panel and the conference in general about sort of disappointment with how Russia has turned out, that it's gone back in an authoritarian direction, how can we promote liberalism? But might there not be a third scenario for Russia, which is much worse than Putinist authoritarianism, which is absolute chaos? Putin has destroyed every institution in society, and I wonder what's going to happen when he goes, if Russia plunges into absolute chaos, and how does the world prepare for that scenario?
So that we have time for the two follow-up questions, which I'd like to wrap. Only Marieluise on that, and the others will get a chance on the last questions.
Okay. Of course, your perspective might be possible. Nobody knows. We, unfortunately, the Kremlin, the inside circle of power, is so little transparent that really we do not even know who is playing which role. Whether there is debates already within the circle of power, whether Putin is being pushed or whether he's pushing others or whether it's both, how big organized crime and the FSB as an institution of its own is part of that big game. We don't know it. Your question, though, being in Poland, brings me back to a historian phase when German social democratic politics said Solidarność means instability. And thus we rather stick to Jaruzelski. And I hope that we are not going to make the same mistake taking Russia.
There are two questions in the middle, and if you can both sort of frame it in a one-sentence question, that would be much appreciated so that I don't get trouble with the organizers.
Thank you. Marcin Kilanowski, Altruist Society, Oxford University. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Professor Ash. You were referring to the idea of stripping down the universal principles to the very core. I would be happy if you could elaborate very briefly and give us an example of what that core would be for you and for the others, I believe. And for Mr. Rostowski, you were saying that we have a highly dysfunctional Eurozone. How would you fix it?
So that question I'm going to rule out, having ruled it in before. But your other question will be answered by Timothy in a moment, and the gentleman in front of you will ask the other question. So, because I gave you rights for one question also.
I'll try and be very brief for Tim Matarashek. You raise this very interesting strategy of trying to sort of strip down the ideas to have a much more fundamental dialogue. Question is, and I think it's been answered by the panel, is actually anybody listening? The big difference between now and 1989 is that you had elites in 89 and societies which were much more susceptible to either reason or dialogue. The second more fundamental question is, even if we are talking to somebody on the other side, is that conversation not going to be drowned out by the drums of war? If you look at South China Sea, Ukraine, ISIL, the key imperative for the West is how to defeat these, or how to challenge these states or ideas militarily. Okay, is there any room for dialogue?
So, Timothy, if you could answer the question of the first gentleman, and Ilmar and Jacek, if you could tackle elements of the second question.
If I could take both a bit together and say that I have a very simple answer, which is our stripped-down universal principles on free speech can be found on a website called freespeechdebate.com, the Oxford University website in 30 languages, and also in my book,
Did you pay a
which will be
commercial fee to the
available
Atlantic?
in all good Amazons next spring.
Please pre-order
to
now.
Marek's point,
Shame.
who's listening, the interesting thing about the experience of the website is that the biggest single group of visitors to the website at the beginning were Chinese until the website was blocked in China. If I may very quickly, so the appetite is definitely there. The question is, how do you reach those people? And to that, I think there are several answers. One is, if we can't get the ideas to them there, then get them to us here. And that means bring as many as possible foreign students to our universities, Ukrainian students to Polish universities, Indian students to British universities, Chinese students to German universities. That is one of the best things we can do long term to win the war of ideas. And by the way, if our publics would take it, also visa-free travel. I think that's a really important point. Very quickly, if I may, I just have to defend the BBC against my old friend Jacek Rostowski. Jacek, the reason the BBC has such extraordinary credibility and has had for decades is precisely that it is not seen as an arm of British state propaganda. That it may be a bit too self-critical for you, but that it is self-critical. It's seen as such. And the problem with the BBC is not that it's self-critical. The problem is it's so desperately underfunded, you could almost see the sellotape peeling off the cardboard.
And if I may suggest to Jacek that we've covered the BBC enough, and if you could take the broader questions so that we get a good answer.
Sure.
And then
on Marek Matraszek's question, yes, you have the intellectual superstructure, the economic base, but military power is part of the superstructure. And I think the answer to your question is very simple, given by Theodore Roosevelt. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. And your arguments become much more intellectually convincing the more tanks and fighter aircraft and stealth aircraft and other instruments of that kind you have. And I think we cannot be naive about this. It's absolutely vital and central not to attack people, but to know that, so that our opponents should know that we have the overwhelming superiority, which means that they can't play the kind of games that they've been getting away with in eastern Ukraine.
Ilmar, for 1 minute. You have,
Yeah.
Did you want to? No, Ilmar, because the other panels come out. Do you have?
Yeah, please.
Oh.
No, I just...
Just firstly, answering to the question, is there any third way, or should we be afraid of chaos in Russia? Then, yes, this is a question that is quite many times raised, but from the point of view of the Baltic countries, this is almost irrelevant in a sense that if we see that the politics of sphere of influence, so spheres of influence is coming back, then for us this is only questions whether you like to be shot or burned alive, and both
Thank you very much.
are not really what you like.
To Jacek's concern about more muscular Western foreign policy, I learned last night during this conference that the Swedish army, Sweden is sort of next to Estonia, has a total, I was told, of 7,000 soldiers. That's quite a threat. The British army will fit into Wembley Stadium and some soon, and some will say smaller stadiums, 80,000 and stuff. And living in Washington for the past 30 years, I think there's one overriding concern with regard to the muscular stuff that we all hope for. Americans changed to pensions that people need to invest in themselves some 20 years ago. And the average pension savings of an American are about $1,000, not per month, but in total supposed to last for 30 years and more, given current longevity. So, and Timothy, of course, taught me that in Britain that's a long question already, pensions versus defense, and for now the British government has made its choice. Jacek used to live there, Timothy still does. Timothy is hopeful that the Brits will develop the muscle. We all are hopeful, but on that happy note, and seeing the great former Polish foreign minister in the audience, I want to thank this panel, Ilmar, Jacek, Marieluise, and Timothy. Thank you very much for participating in our debate. And to the audience.